now being recorded. And I will share my screen and we can get started. PowerPoint, there we go. Share. Okay. Let's do slideshow. Current from beginning. Okay. Okay, so we're going to start with a few things from last week. This is not something that came up last week, but we had talked about the Baltimore Harbor, and I got an email from, I think, the Downtown Partnership, and there is a whole new Rash Field on the south side of the harbor. They have added playgrounds, a skate park, a lawn, a pavilion, it says, with a green roof overlook, and a nature park which has native plants and a rain garden. And I noticed I am on the Winter in the City Committee, and you haven't seen the schedule yet, but it's coming out shortly. They're still open for new ideas if you have any, but get them in quickly. But one of them is a walk that, and a boat ride, I think, that is down at the harbor. And one of the places they are going to be visiting is the new Rash Field. So there's your chance to go see it. We mentioned the Benjamin Banneker Park, which is near Oella. It's not actually, I guess it's in Oella. It's not right in the town. And this is some information about it. It's a county park. It's 142 acres. And among other things they have, there is a museum about Banneker's life, a reconstruction of the cabin he lived in, some gardens, an orchard, and walking trails on the site. And that is the address. And if you just Google Benjamin Banneker Historical Park, you can find out when it's open and how to get there. And thank you, Susan Wolf, who sent me something about the Patapsco River. Scientists have caught a fish, the first one of this species, which is alewife, which is a kind of herring, that they have seen in the river in over 100 years. And this is a result of removing the Bloated Dam and the two other dams that have been removed. And it's considered an important species. So this is nice news for the river. So, one sec, let me just get something here. Okay. So this week, we're going to be talking about the Patuxent River. You're too late for this year's Patuxent River Appreciation Days. This is a festival which seems to be sometimes one day and sometimes 2 days, and it's all about the river. It is held at the Calvert Marine Museum in Solomons, Maryland, which is down near the mouth of the river. And maybe you will catch it next year. We'll be talking about that museum later. So this is a map of the watershed of the Patuxent. It is the longest river entirely within the state of Maryland. It's approximately 115 miles long, from the headwaters up here to the mouth down here where it flows into the Chesapeake. If I can figure out how to get my cursor on the map, I can show you that, but there you go. There's the mouth. And it has a long history in the state. There are many interesting places to visit along the river, including parks, wildlife sanctuaries, historic sites, museums, and a naval air testing station. And for all these reasons, I have thought it was worth spending an entire class on this river. So one of the things you can see on this map is that this is the river, and it is also the boundary of a number of counties. And I'll show you a county map in a minute where you can see it a little more clearly. The name Patuxent, like many of Maryland's rivers, is a Native American word. It was the name of one of the tribes that lived in the area down near the mouth of the river. And it is said to be from the Algonquin languages, meaning water running over smooth stones. So here's a county map. And if you follow these boundaries, this is actually the Patuxent River. Howard, Montgomery here, Prince George's and Anne Arundel. It's a boundary between Calvert and two different counties, Charles up here and St. Mary's down here. And then this is the mouth of the river and where it flows into the bay. Up at the headwaters, it's kind of a four corners. It's not exactly four corners, but Frederick, Carroll, Montgomery, and Howard all come together around here. And this is where the headwaters are, and it is also near the headwaters of the Patapsco River, which is a place called Parr's Spring, very close to the headwaters of the Patuxent. Up here, it's basically a little trickle. You can walk across it. And down here at Drum Point, where it flows into the bay, it is about 2.5 miles wide. And like all the rivers that flow into the bay, in its lower reaches, it is tidal. And the tidal part goes about 55 miles upstream, which is about to here, somewhere near Route 50. This is a bridge near the mouth, the Governor Thomas Johnson Bridge. It was built in 1977, and it is 1.37 miles long. It connects St. Mary's County with Calvert County, and it is named for the first governor of Maryland. The nearest bridge upstream is 20 miles away. This is near the small town of Benedict in Charles County. It connects Charles and Calvert counties, excuse me. And it is a swing bridge. You can see the part of the bridge in the middle here that swings around to open and lets ships pass through. And at this point, the river is about 1/2 mile wide. So pretty wide still, but not as wide as down by the mouth. And we will see the town of Benedict again when we are talking about the War of 1812, where the river plays a role. Here is a bridge further upstream near the city of Bowie. And this is above the head of navigation of the river. It's no longer tidal. And you can see how much narrower the river is here, and you don't need a very big bridge to cross it, and the bridge doesn't have to open for ships. So the tidal portion of the river, down toward the mouth, was a shipping route like many of the other rivers flowing into the bay, and it was used when the main cash crop was tobacco to bring tobacco to market. This is a former tobacco plantation. It's in St. Mary's County. It's called Sotterley. And like many of the other plantations, it had its own wharf on the river to ship tobacco to Europe. The original building was built in 1703 and was a 2-room house. I'm not sure if this building on the right is part of the building, is the original building. But it was added to and enlarged over the years, as you can see. And right through the middle of the 20th century, it had only been owned by 4 different families. The last owner decided to restore the house and open it to the public. So the property is a historic landmark, a national landmark. It's open for tours, And it is the only tidewater plantation in Maryland that is open to the public. Being a tobacco plantation, the main labor was done by enslaved African Americans. And this is a slave cabin on the property, former slave cabin. As of 1699, the plantation had 2,000 acres. It's now 95 acres, but it has barns, a warehouse, and this cabin in addition to the main house. And this is a map of the plantation. The main house is here. Here's the river up here, and you can see there's a road going down to where the wharf would have been. I don't think there's one there now. Here's the barn, and I think this is the slave cabin. And there are gardens and other things on the property. So Sotterley Plantation is operated by the Board of Trustees of a foundation. And the Board of Trustees now includes not only descendants of former owners, but descendants of some of the enslaved people that worked there. You can visit this all year, but the house itself is only open for tours between May and October. They also have a farm that sells produce, and it is also rented out as a wedding venue. And if you are looking for to go there, looking on the map, it is near the town of Hollywood, again in St. Mary's County, which is on either the west side or the south side of the river, depending on how you orient yourself. So before European settlers arrived, the land along the Patuxent was home to Native American tribes, including the Patuxents, who gave their name to the river. And they have now found artifacts in the area that date to as early as 9,500 years ago. And this is a map of the tribes of Southern Maryland that was based on information provided by John Smith, or it says in the title of the map, as seen by Captain John Smith, his party of 12 men and more recent observers. So here is the Patuxent here, and this is the Potomac, and there are a number of different tribes that lived in the area. And I'm sorry, I don't know how this got to be so small. This is an exhibit at the Calvert Marine Museum about the Native Americans of the Patuxent. And again, we'll be talking more about this museum later. So this discussion of archaeological findings leads us to the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. This is in Calvert County, kind of more or less across the river from where Sotterley is. It is a state park and museum. It is near the town of St. Leonard. It's a 560-acre park, and it is a site where they have found many Native American artifacts. And here are some of the activities that go on in the park. They have an archaeology lab, the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab, the MAC, and they are a clearinghouse for any archaeological finds found in Maryland by state and federal agencies. And they give tours of the lab on Thursday morning. The park also has a recreation of an Indian village, and they have various events about that. It has longhouses, which you can see in the picture. It has a fire pit, racks for smoking fish, and a garden. There are hiking and biking trails, and canoe and kayak launching ramps, and gardens. The park was the property of a gentleman named Jefferson Patterson. He was an American diplomat, and his widow gave the estate to the state of Maryland in 1983. So before the 19th century, there were Native Americans and then Europeans who grew tobacco. And by the 19th century, the area around the Patuxent was an agricultural community. It was connected by water transportation to Baltimore, Washington, Norfolk, and other points along the Chesapeake Bay. At first, this would have been by sailing ships, but after 1813, there were steamboats that began to take over the transportation. And of course, they continued to serve the bay until the Bay Bridge was built in the 1960s. The main line that served the Patuxent River was called the Weems Steamboat Company. And this is a stock certificate from the company. Says of Baltimore City. And that is, I guess that's a picture of a steamboat on the certificate. The Weems boats left Baltimore to go down the bay, up the Patuxent, the Potomac, the Rappahannock in Virginia and other places. And they all left Baltimore between 4 and 8 p.m. So if you were there then, you would see a constant procession of boats leaving the harbor. Typically, there would be stops at many landings along the river, and the boats would carry passengers and freight, including farm produce, tobacco, and livestock. Farmers would use the boats to send their produce to market, and passengers would travel for business or visiting family, or just going to the big city, that's Baltimore, for the theater or other entertainment, or sometimes medical appointments. And it was a leisurely way to travel. And this is a book. And by the way, at the end of the class, I am going to be sending, at the end of the course, I'm going to be sending everyone a bibliography that I'm putting together with any of the books that we talked about during the course, if you want to try and find them and read them. So this is a book, Tidewater by Steamboat. It will tell you everything you might want to know about the steamboat lines that serve the communities along the Chesapeake. It has boat specifications and many other details. It's a little technical, but at the end, the author adds an epilogue to give you a flavor of traveling by steamboat. And this is a typical steamboat, Potomac. And this is a paragraph from the epilogue. Quote, "The smells of the steamboat vary by the deck. On the hurricane deck, that's the top deck here, the sulfurous odor of coal smoke from the stack mixes with that of steam, bearing the taint of oil or grease emanating around the walking beam from the engine far below. In the saloon and staterooms, and that would have been this deck, the scent of disinfectant, soap, and wood polish permeates the spaces with its pungency. Near the galley, rich foods under preparation spread their own aroma. And on the freight deck, and this is down here, the sweetness of crated fruit and produce vies with the stench of cattle. From the boat itself comes the tang of old wood, tar, hemp, and the brine of the bay." And one more quote. This is from a blog that I found of someone who was lamenting the lost steamboats and the decaying wharves that they left behind. Quote, "There were once hundreds of them, that is the wharves. Just about any spot, a country road dead-ended at Tidewater. They were the lifeblood of communities, a portal to the world beyond. Folks once planned their days, their seasons around them. But now the rotting pilings that descend into murky water do little service to the long-lost importance and memory of these forgotten landmarks. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, steamboats were central to Chesapeake commerce and communication, long before motor vehicles and telephone wires linked every spot on the mainland. The wharves where these stately ships made landings were bustling junctions, alive with merchants conducting business, passengers readying for travel, crewmen coaxing their mighty craft to moorings. These frenetic waterfront scenes have long fallen silent. End quote. So that gives you some idea of what life was like when in the steamboat era. The last run of the last active steamboat sailed on April 13th, 1962. It was the city of Norfolk of the old Bay Line. And of course, by then, the Bay Bridge had been built. Maryland had a good road system, and cars could get you there faster than boats, even if it wasn't as pleasant a way to travel. And of course, if you were going to the Eastern Shore, you would have to sit in a long traffic jam to cross the Bay Bridge, unless you go maybe at midnight or 2 in the morning or something. So before we go on, I'm going to stop and ask Mary Lee if there are any questions. Want to unmute yourself?
Yes, there's there's one comment. I gotta see, from Fran Cannon. She said Benjamin Banneker Park is practically around the corner from where she lives. She's been there many times and recommends it.
Okay, great.
And that's the only comment.
And if you go down Frederick Road from Catonsville, you can get to Owella Avenue from the south. There's also a way to get to from the north, but I'm not that familiar with that. Okay, now we're going to go on to another use of the river, another aspect of it, and that is water supply. This is the Triadelphia Reservoir, owned by the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, usually known as WSSC. It was built, this is the Brighton Dam, which created the reservoir, and it was built in 1942. It's near Brookville in Montgomery County, and the road that crosses the dam is called Brighton Dam Road. And Brighton Dam Road connects Route 32 in Clarksville with New Hampshire Avenue, if you are familiar with that part of Montgomery County. Triadelphia was a mill town on the site, but it had mostly been destroyed by the 1868 floods. So it wasn't really there by the time the reservoir was created, unlike some of the other reservoirs. The reservoir holds 6.3 billion gallons of water, and the WSSC is a bi-county authority providing drinking water and treating wastewater for both Montgomery and Prince George's County. So that is why it is called the Suburban Sanitary Commission. Washington, D.C. does their own thing. The land around the reservoir, which you can see is wooded, is used for hiking, bike riding, picnicking, fishing, and hunting. And you can boat on the water by permit, but only with a boat that is either self-powered or battery-powered, no gasoline engines. In 1952, about 10 years later, the WSSC built the Rocky Gorge Reservoir just downstream from Triadelphia. It's located between Laurel and Burtonsville in Montgomery County. And if you're driving south on Route 29 toward Washington, you have crossed this reservoir. And this is, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why this one came out so small. Anyway, this is a gentleman who has caught a very large fish in the Rocky Gorge Reservoir. It holds 5.5 billion gallons of water, a little smaller than Triadelphia. And the land around it has the same kind of uses for recreation as the Triadelphia Reservoir. This is a logo from when the WSSC celebrated its centennial year in 2018. And the dam at Rocky Gorge is called the T. Howard Duckett Dam. It is named for an attorney and entrepreneur from PG County. He helped draft the legislation to create the commission in 1918 and then served on its board. And he was considered the founding father of the WSSC. It's a 6-member commission. There are 3 from Montgomery and 3 from Prince George's, each appointed by the county executive and approved by the county council. And WSSC was in the news a little while ago because the city, Baltimore City, having trouble with its finances, software, and infrastructure. As you know, the city provides water for Baltimore County and wastewater treatment. The county council recently adopted a resolution asking for an investigation of the possible creation of a joint authority, which would be similar in principle to the WSSC. In other words, take the authority away from the city or to share it with the city. But this would have to be created by an act of the Maryland legislature, and as far as I know, it has not gone anywhere since then. So before we go on, are there any questions about water supply? Mary Lee?
No questions or comments?
Okay. Now we're going to have some military discussions. Whoops. This is Commodore Joshua Barney. He was a naval officer. He had served in the American Revolution. After that revolution, we reduced the size of the Navy and he joined the French Navy. But then he later rejoined the US Navy, and in the War of 1812, he created a flotilla of shallow draft boats to harass the British Navy in the Chesapeake. And because they were shallow draft, they could escape British ships by sailing up the rivers that flow into the Chesapeake, where the British ships couldn't follow. Somebody say something? In June of 1814, his flotilla fought British ships on the Patuxent and escaped into St. Leonard's Creek in Calvert County. They eventually escaped the British, but in the end, Barney had to order that the boats be scuttled to prevent the British from capturing them. This is a map of the War of 1812 in the Chesapeake area. In August of 1814, the British sailed up the Patuxent, and this is the route they took here. They landed at Benedict, which is here. And from there, they marched to Bladensburg. And I don't know if you can see yeah, here's Bladensburg on the map. And at the Battle of Bladensburg, they met and defeated American troops. And after that, that was their resistance for Washington, D.C. They were able to march to Washington and burn the White House and the Capitol and other buildings in the city. So that was kind of one of the low points of that war. Of course, one of the high points was in Baltimore, where they defeated the British. But we're not going there today. So on to a war in the 20th century. At the end of World War I, there was a ghost fleet on the river. It was 4 former German passenger liners that had been interned by the US during the war. After the war, they were laid up at a mooring in the Patuxent on the Calvert County side, near where the Thomas Johnson Bridge is now. They came to be known as the Ghost Fleet, and they were a tourist attraction. But they were only there until 1941, when they were taken away and sold for scrap, which was needed during the war. And now in Solomon's, there is this sign commemorating the Ghost Fleet, where you could have seen them when they were there. And if you want to know more about them, there is a book. This is published, I think it's published by the Calvert Marine Museum. Yeah, it says so on the bottom. And this is what they look like. And it is available at the Marine Museum. And there is also another ghost fleet in Maryland. This one is on the Potomac River, and we will have a look at it next week, or next time when we talk about the Potomac. So the biggest impact of the military on the Patuxent was in World War II, when the Navy created the Patuxent Naval Air Station. It was, as you can see on this, it was begun in 1943, and it was to centralize naval air testing facilities. They have 14,500 acres, that's very big, at Cedar Point in St. Mary's County. And it also now includes some facilities nearby, across the river, and on Bloodworth Island in the Chesapeake, where they have a weapons testing range. And let me see, before we go on, I want to, okay, I'll come back. We'll come back later, but I just wanted to show you the map. This is where the Naval Air Station is. Bloodworth Island is here. And I think they also have some facilities across the Patuxent on the Calvert County side. So this is the Naval Air Station from the air with a plane flying across it. This is the entrance. Something Center of Excellence for Naval Aviation, it says on the sign. It's the headquarters of 2 naval air divisions. And among the things they do are train test pilots, test airfield equipment, and test instruments and weaponry. And during the recent base realignment and closure, known as BRAC, they were a beneficiary. There were 20,000 new employees added to this facility during the BRAC period in the 1990s. They host air shows. This is the Blue Angels performing. And there was also a museum near the Naval Air Station. It's called the Patuxent River Naval Air Museum. It was established in 1975. It's run by volunteers, and it is near the town of Lexington Park. It has the history of U.S. naval aviation technology with artifacts, photographs, and documents of the Naval Air Station and other stations. And its exhibits include flight simulators, flight test artifacts like ejection seats, and a collection of naval airplanes, of which this is one called the X-32. I guess it's a propeller plane, I can't quite tell. So again, this is the map. It shows where the Naval Air Station is and also their weapons testing facility on Bloodworth Island. So the river is also a place where there are research facilities. There are 2 major ones. This is the logo of the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory of the University of Maryland. The full title is on the bottom of the logo. And it is located in Solomons at the river's mouth. And let me go back to the map. And Solomons is down around, right around here. It is a research facility where they study estuarine systems, and they, among the issues they study are water pollution, fisheries, and restoration ecology. This is one of the research labs where they study water quality, and they pump water out of the river for their research purposes. The laboratory also has outreach programs in the community, and one of the things they do are give talks, and this is some seminars that were given a few years ago. And they have a visitor center where you can visit and learn about what the laboratory does and take a tour of the campus. And this is one of several research campuses that the University of Maryland has. The center, University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science is the actual organization. There's one in downtown Baltimore. There is one on Horn Point on the Chop Tank near Cambridge. And there's one in Frostburg. The other major research facility is the Patuxent Research Refuge. This is 12,000 acres. It was established in 1936 for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it is both a research facility and a large public park. And it has three sections: the North Tract, the Central Tract, and the South Tract. The North Tract is the biggest one. It's divided from the Central Tract by the river, which is here, crosses the refuge in the middle. The Central Tract is where they do research, and that is closed to the public. And then this is Maryland Route 197, and the South Tract, which is also open to the public, is on the other side of the road. The North Tract is the largest area. It's open for hunting and fishing. It has wildlife and wildlife observation trails, and you can drive on some of the roads around it. And if you go on a road, you might see a sign like this: slow wildlife crossing. And you can see some of the kinds of wildlife that you might find there. And this is one of the many kinds of wildlife you might see. One of the lakes there. This is a killdeer. It's a kind of a plover. And it is looking for insects to eat. It inhabits mud flats and grasslands. So that is research on the river. And before we go on, Mary Lee, are there any questions?
Yes, there are three some comments.
Okay.
Okay, Michael Baker said the British took prisoners at Upper Marlborough after they sacked Washington. They were the prisoners Francis Scott Key negotiated for their release in Baltimore Harbor when he wrote the poem that became the Star Spangled Banner.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Right. Amanda Joyce commented, Joshua Barney's flotilla joined the militia after the Mosquito fleet was scuttled. And the British commander at the Battle of Bladensburg later said they were the only defenders who put up a fierce fight.
Okay.
A significant number of Barney's sailors were African American.
Oh.
Great book about this, Flotilla by Donald Chomet. Okay, and one more. Oh, Michael Baker again said, I did some work at Pax River and have a couple things to say and a question. So you might want to call on him, Michael Baker.
Okay. Michael, where are you?
Okay, well, in 1972, I was working for a company called Scientific Data Systems, and we proposed to put together a real-time flight test system to computerize what the people at Pax River at the Naval Air Test Center were using. That's where they tested all their new fighter aircraft. And the way it used to work was that each engineer looking at a piece of what was going on in the airplane had their own analog machine that they would read, and there was a whole bank of those guys, and if something might go wrong, then they had to do an intervention, but it was at human speed. And there were more than a few of those aircraft that ended up in the Chesapeake Bay over a period of time. And we made the world's first real-time flight test system, and the thing worked. It was it was really something. Now, one of the, well, it's actually two of the engineers that we work with lived in over in Calvert County. They were old timers. They called it Culvert County.
Culvert.
Culvert. That's what Louis did. Louis Goldstein always called it Culvert County.
Yep.
But they had a boat pool to come to work, because if you were in Solomons and you worked at Pax River, if you drove, you'd have to go way up the Patuxent River, up all the way up to Hughesville before you could go across it and come back down again. So they had boat pool.
Michael, can I ask, was that before the Thomas Johnson Bridge was built?
Yeah, it was 1972. That bridge was,
Seven, I think.
they hadn't even proposed the bridge at that point.
Okay, thank you.
But we, there were a couple of things.
Oh, come on.
We had, we would have meetings, and one time I asked the engineer who had the boat for the boat pool if he would take us out on the river for a meeting. And I said, if we did that, we could, I would provide the food. And we sailed right over to one of the skipjacks, oystering, and we bought a bushel of oysters right off the skipjack, for part of our meeting, which was a treat. I'd never been that close to a skipjack before. It was a really fine looking boat.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah, and I was told that that part where the Pax River meets the Chesapeake Bay is considered a natural harbor, and it's quite deep. And they told me that I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but they told me that there was a submarine base on the Pax River, and
interesting. I've never come across.
And submarines would sail up. Those during World War II, some submarines would sail up the bay to the Pax River and go to the building where they would come up out of the water indoors, so nobody could see what was going on. And they said the reason that they could do that is because it was a natural harbor there.
Okay, well, thank you. That's really interesting. And your mention of oysters takes us a perfect segue into the next thing I'm going to talk about, Patuxent River oysters. So the river is a habitat in addition to everything else. Many kinds of living creatures, and some of them are edible by humans. And over the years, the river has supported a very productive commercial fishery, especially in the lower tidal reaches, which is where you would have been. They're fished for oysters, crabs, eels, clams, and fish. And these conditions down there are saline. They are salty or brackish, which supports this kind of life. And above about the lowest 20 miles of the river is where the salinity is high enough to support this kind of marine life. And there have been at least 26 different companies that packed oysters from the Patuxent between 1867 and 1984. There were canneries at Solomons near the mouth of the river, and at Brooms Island, a few miles upstream. And the oysters were considered so good that they were advertised, as you can see on all these cans, as Patuxent River oysters. And take a look at the one on the upper left, J.C. Lohr and Sons, and we'll hear more about J.C. Lohr in a bit. And in St. Mary's County in October, they have the U.S. Oyster Festival. This is a national festival which involves oyster shucking contests. And you can see that in the low of the second picture here, the U.S. National Oyster Shucking Championships. They have some amateur contests, then they have some professional contests. And at the very end is the national major oyster shucking contest with the national champion. And they have oyster cooking, and it's a lot of other celebratory things, music and so on. And it's held at the fairgrounds in Leonardtown in St. Mary's County. This is a clam tub, which was for sale on eBay. They harvested clams in the peak time was actually in the 20th century, in the 1950s and 60s. But after that, the state set limits on the kinds of hydraulic dredges that could be used to harvest clams. And then Hurricane Agnes in 1972 flooded the fisheries with fresh water, and that was more or less the end of it. People also fish for crabs in the river, and they also fish for eels during the period when they are migrating up the river. This is a picture of some eels that were caught in a trap. It was from an article in the Sun about the decline of eels in the Chesapeake. They had been overfished, partly due to very high demand from Asian markets where they are considered a great delicacy. And they also people caught rockfish and other kinds of fish in the water with various kinds of nets. And if you want to know more about that, this book, Working the Water, is the book to read. It has many detailed illustrations of the kinds of gear that were used. And the subtitle is The Commercial Fisheries of Maryland's Patuxent River. But the era of tobacco and steamboats and oyster canning on the river the river's past, although there's still a little bit of commercial harvesting. Today, the most important uses of the river are water supply, which we saw, and for recreation. And this is a water trail guide. You've seen some others, but this one is not prepared by the Department of Natural Resources. This is prepared by the Patuxent Riverkeeper. This trail guide covers 62 river miles of the river plus various points along the river where you can see things and where you can put in and take out boats, out in camp and so on. And it includes the river from Solomon's at the mouth up to Bowie, again, where you can no longer paddle. And this is a map of protected lands of the watershed, and anything on here, there's some public and private sites, but you can see there's an awful lot of land along the river that is protected. There are federal, state, and county lands and one municipal park, which is in the city of Laurel. And it's a little confusing because several of them have Patuxent in the name. There is Patuxent River State Park on the upper part of the river. There is the Patuxent Research Refuge, which is federal. Prince George's County has a Patuxent River Park and a Patuxent River Park South. And in Charles County, there is the Patuxent River Natural Resource Area. And there are a whole bunch of other state parks along the river in Calvert, St. Mary's, and Anne Arundel County. And then there's this, again, the city of Laurel, it's Riverfront Park, and the two reservoirs, which are also parkland. Oh, I am sorry. I don't know I tried to make it a little smaller and it got much smaller. Well, anyway, this is somebody fishing in the Patuxent River, in the state park, which is on the upper 12 miles of the river in Howard and Montgomery counties. And it is mostly natural areas and farmlands used for hunting, fishing, hiking, and horseback riding. And there are a number of parking areas where you can access the park. This is the visitor center. It is off Georgia Avenue, Route 97 in Brookville in Montgomery. And then going to the lower Patuxent River, these are various public areas along the lower part of the river. There are two large natural areas across from one another, Jug Bay and the Merkel Wildlife Sanctuary, which are up here. And this is, Jug Bay is a wetland sanctuary in Anne Arundel County. This is their logo and a picture of a boardwalk through the wetlands. And it is the largest tidal freshwater wetland in Maryland. They have woodlands, wetlands, meadows, and 15 miles of trails. And across the river in PG County is the Merkel Wildlife Sanctuary, owned by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And the Audubon Society has combined these two areas and some other nearby areas into one place, I guess you might say, they call an IBA, or an important bird area, an area where you can see many different species of birds. Because of the tidal area, it rises and falls more than 2 feet. So at low tide, there are mud flats, which is unusual for an inland river. There are many different plant species, and the IBA includes portions of Merkel, of Jug Bay, and also Patuxent River Park in Prince George's County. Patuxent River Park also has an interesting museum complex, the Patuxent River Rural Life Museums. This is a museum with buildings, typical historical buildings from the early days of European settlement in the area. And this is from a little later on in the museum. This is the Simplex Cottage. And this is a house that you could order as a kit from the Sears catalog and build it yourself. This house cost $400 when it was bought and built in 1923. And then for $40 more, you could get a separate kit and build yourself an outhouse to go with it. So just up the river from the Rural Life Museums is the Mount Calvert Historical and Archaeological Park. Mount Calvert was the first county seat of Prince George's County in 1696. They do ongoing archaeology here, and they have a museum documenting, quote, 8,000 years of human culture. And this park is open on Saturday and Sunday. So moving further south to where the Patuxent meets the bay is probably the most, quote, Patuxent, unquote, museum of all, the Calvert Marine Museum in Solomons. They cover both the cultural and natural history of Southern Maryland, paleontology, the estuary life of the tidal Patuxent, and the maritime history of the area. They have a collection of boats, an aquarium, fossils, and a resident river otter. The lighthouse in the picture is the Drum Point Lighthouse, had been moved to the museum from Drum Point when it was no longer needed there. And it is a, excuse me, a screw pile type of lighthouse. There used to be 45 of these around the Chesapeake. Now there are 3 left, and one of them is in the Inner Harbor, the Knoll Lighthouse. Don't know where the third one is. I was unable to find that out. One of the permanent exhibits in the museum is the dinosaurs of Maryland. This is, Maryland has a state dinosaur, the Astrodon johnstoni. He's the first dinosaur fossil to be found in Maryland. They have found others since. And they have a specimen from the paleontology collection, a skull of an aquatic reptile from the age of the dinosaurs called the Mosasaurus. The museum publishes a newsletter called the Bug-Eye Times, Bug-Eye being one of the boats, the oystering boats. And the museum owns a boat called the William T. Dennison. It's a converted Bug-Eye, and it offers cruises around Solomon Island in the summer. And if you remember when we looked at the oyster cans, one of them was from the J.C. Lohr Oyster House. Well, this is the J.C. Lohr Oyster House, which is now part of the museum. And it is near the museum, and it has exhibits about oyster processing and seafood packaging, which is what they did. And again, every year they have the Patuxent River Appreciation Days, and this gives you some idea of what goes on there. And if you go to the website, calvertmarinemuseum.com, you can find out when the next one is, but it won't be until next October. Well, let's see. Yeah, today, we're in November already. We missed this year's, right? So while you are down in Solomon's, this is a picture of Solomon's Island, and this is the island. It is L-shaped. This is a bridge. It's a very narrow little strait separating the island from the mainland. And so when you cross it, you might not even realize you're entering an island. The museum, the Marine Museum is up on the mainland part, but if you drive onto the island down here, you can visit the Chesapeake biological the laboratory that we had talked about. That's where it is. The island also has a boardwalk and gazebo on the narrow part of the L here, with shops and restaurants and views of the river. And this is a view of part of the river walk on Solomon's Island. And one more little piece of information about the river. This is the town of aerial of the town of Eagle Harbor. Eagle Harbor was developed in the 1920s as a summer resort for middle-class African Americans. It is currently not much used, has a lot of vacant housing, and they are trying to figure out what to do to plan for their future. And there's a nuclear power plant not very far away, which probably doesn't help. But here is the logo of the town of Eagle Harbor, Board of Commissioners, and the date that it was founded. So the river is not as clean as it used to be, and not as productive. So who is advocating to try and clean it up? Well, before we talk about that, we need to talk about the Patuxent River wade-in. And this is a picture of a recent wade-in, not from this year, from a couple of years ago. It was started by a gentleman named Bernie Fowler. It's called the Bernie Fowler wade-in, actually. And the gentleman in the big straw hat is Mr. Fowler, who is now 97 years old and still joining it. He was a state senator from Calvert County. He grew up on the river, fishing and crabbing. And he remembered that he was able to wade into the water and still see his white sneakers on the bottom when he was chest deep. But when he tried it again, the river was so, as an adult, the river was so muddy, he was only 10 inches into the water before his sneakers disappeared from view. He decided to get some other people with him and do it again, and it became an annual event where a lot of people come out to wade in with him. And the so-called sneaker index keeps track of how dirty the water is. It's held on a Sunday in June. It started on his property on the river, but it's now held at Jefferson Patterson Park. And he is still leading it. The 34th annual wade-in was held in June of this year, and the sneakers were visible up to 34 inches of water, a little less than a couple of years before that, which was disappointing. And here is how the professionals do the same thing. This is called a Secchi disc. It's an 8-inch disc with black and white quadrants, and when you lower it into the water, it's easy to see until it disappears, and the rope will tell you what the depth of water is, where it disappears, and that's how you one index of water quality. So in 1968, Maryland adopted the Scenic and Wild Rivers Act. We talked about that. And the Patuxent was one of the rivers that was designated as scenic. They prepared a river management plan to identify resource issues and programs that affected the river and make recommendations about recreational use and the conservation and protection of certain features. In 1984, the state created the Patuxent River Commission. This is their logo. It's the only river in the state that had its own commission. And what do they do? Well, here are the members. They have 34 members, as you can see, from counties, the state, various districts, various what they call stakeholders. And it adopts a policy plan for the watershed. The original one was adopted in 1984. It was updated again in 1997 and then 2015. And every other year they adopt an implementation plan. Their website says the Patuxent River Commission serves as a steward for the Patuxent River and commits to lead and inspire actions to protect, enhance, and restore river species, as well as the natural, cultural, economic, and recreational values in the watershed. Well, we'll see how that works a little later. One of its goals is to promote tourism, and they have the Patuxent River. This is a map from that map that we saw before, comes from one of their policy plans. The Patuxent River Challenge, which they issue, they have a list of 14 activities at different sites along the river, including hikes, picnics, fishing, and paddling, and so on. And the challenge is to visit one site in each of the 7 counties along the river, plus the city of Laurel, and document it with a selfie of doing the activity. And this is a map of the sites in the Patuxent River Challenge. Well, in addition to the commission, there is the Patuxent River Keeper, and we talked about river keepers. It is a nonprofit watershed advocacy organization. It's affiliated with the National Waterkeeper Alliance, and it was established in 2004. This is their building. It's in Nottingham near Upper Marlboro in Peachey County. It is near the Merkel Wildlife Sanctuary. It has offices, meeting rooms, and a store, and they rent canoes and kayaks. They own a boat and they monitor the river spills, and they can sue polluters. They also coordinate volunteer efforts to do cleanups. They have a crew of volunteers that calls themselves the Patuxent Roughnecks to maintain and clean the water trail. And their motto is, to clean up a river, somebody has to get dirty. In 2007, they issued a report called Patuxent 2020. And they said the Patuxent River Keeper works to conserve, protect, and replenish the state's longest and deepest intrastate waterway. Our tools include strategic advocacy, restoration, and education to achieve long-term sustainability for the ecosystem of the entire Patuxent River Basin and the people who rely on its future. And then I came across a comment, which I am going to read verbatim. This is from the riverkeeper who sits on the commission about something that happened in 2018. Quote, "We have been given the legal opinion, a legal opinion, from the Secretary of the State Planning Agency that by statute is charged with staffing and assisting the commission that says we, the commission, cannot comment on a really ridiculously bad townhouse development project being planned next to the river. This proposed project, one, sits next to and upslope of a highly erodible stretch of the river. Two, on a site recently and very contentiously rezoned. Three, in the middle of a prime historic district. Four, in a state DNR, quote, targeted ecological preservation zone, unquote. And five, it requires a swap with the county of some public parkland originally purchased with program open space funds in order to complete the project, if the county will approve this whole mess. Incidentally, the project is in Howard County, the same county where the headwaters of the Patuxent are located, and where unwise land use decisions recently contributed to enormous flooding, property damage, and loss of life due to stormwater problems. And he's most likely referring to Ellicott City. You would think that sending comments during the public comment phase of the county review process would be the very least we at the commission could do. But guess what? The state doesn't even want us to do that. Surely this speaks volumes about how dodgy and tenuous this proposed development project is. They don't want anybody at the commission to even breathe on this project, and they even chastised a few of us who testified against it as private citizens, end quote. So it sounds like this commission doesn't have any real teeth, and maybe it's going to be up to the riverkeeper to do that. But of course, they don't have the state behind them. They're the private organization, but they can sue, and sometimes they do. So I'm going to stop here. That's the end of our survey of the Patuxent River. See if there are more questions and comments. Mary Lee?
There are two, let's see. Comments. Okay. First from Michael Baker. I did some more okay, he did that. Oh, I also called on the Patuxent Wildlife HP Computer National Birding Program. The first time.
Sorry, you're fading in and out. Can you get closer to your mic or something?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I also called on the Patuxent Wildlife Center. HP Computers supported the National Bird Banding Program. Time I called them, I had to twice. The ducks were walking across the road. What have you work? Okay. The next comment is Jim. The third screw pile lighthouse is located at the mouth of the South River and is called the Thomas Point Light.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. I should have known that.
So that's it.
Okay. So what was the first comment? Was from Michael?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Michael, do you want to add anything to that? Because we have a few minutes.
Well, yeah, there was a sort of a funny thing that happened on my first visit there. The manager of that that particular facility that had more than bird banding in it had a kind of a wicked sense of humor, and so when I went into his office to meet him, right before I went in the office, he opened his window and put some food in a little tray outside the window. And so when we started talking, this big old owl came boom, flying right up to the window and picked up that food. It scared the you know what out of me. He got a big kick out of that.
And that was at the Patuxent Research Refuge, you said?
Yep.
Yeah.
At that. And so I had I guess later in that year, I had a manager that was a real pain in the ass. And so she wanted to go out and call on some of my customers. So I made sure that she got the same reception when she went out to the research center.
Okay. Okay, Susan has her hand up. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, unfortunately, I got on late by 10 minutes this morning and my computer shows its age. It took forever to load. It's terrible. But this was, I think you might have mentioned the, yeah. So just AmericanRivers.org. It's, you know, I give it a couple of bucks a year or whatever, but it's nice to see that they're really pretty good, I think, at making either rivers that are wild and healthy stay that way, which is important, but also cleaning up the rivers that need cleaning. And they seem to have some pretty good track record. So I just thought I'd share that with everybody.
I know they've been advocating for dam removal in a lot of rivers.
Yeah, yeah, especially out west. But the
Yeah.
Patuxent, I mean, the Patapsco was one, but it's for the salmon. And actually, I have a book. It's a Grocer's Companion of 1883. And it talked about the millions of pounds of salmon they got out of the Snake River. And I mean, you think about how we've been just reaping, you know, stuff out of these rivers for decades, 1880s.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You know, that's like 150 years ago or 60 years ago. It's amazing.
Yeah. Okay.
You know.
Jim,
Sure.
Jim has his hand up.
You know, as a boy, I had a couple of experiences in Southern Maryland, which I'll just say is sort of an extension of the Patuxent River. One is that I went to a Boy Scout camp at the site of the Calvert Cliffs nuclear power station, which was called Camp Canoy. And one of the things we did to keep ourselves busy was go on fossil hunts along the bayshore in that very thick clayey sand that exists there.
Yeah.
And there were lots of shark's teeth,
Yeah.
and shells. I wouldn't call them clam shells because they were huge. And also down on the St. Mary's River, which you'll probably talk about next week when you talk about the Potomac, there are fossil banks there as well. The St. Mary's also has quite a bit of frontage on the Patuxent Naval Air Station. But a very beautiful river also in Southern Maryland. Southern Maryland's like a mini Eastern Shore, I think. It's very interesting part of the state.
Thank you. Okay, well, it's our time's up, and it says next week, but it's actually in 2 weeks because next week is our Thanksgiving break. And we'll be talking about what I call the rivers that Maryland shares with other states, which are the Susquehanna on the north and the Potomac on the south. So we will see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Judy.
Judy.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Judy.
Judy.
Bye.
Thank you, Judy. Wonderful as ever. Thank you.
Thank you and happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
All
Thanksgiving,
right.
everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Judy, did you want numbers of the class?
Yeah.
Okay, last week it was 39. Week it was 36.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
See you next time.
Take great class. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.